I'm so very happy to have this opportunity to talk on this topic and explore this topic with you all tonight on grief and Buddhism. This topic is very dear to me. I have a lifelong interest in grief and the effect of grief on individuals and families. And this stemmed really from my very first memory. I was 16 months old, and at that age I experienced the death of my baby sister. And it was interesting in that it wasn't so much grief that I experienced, but a tremendous confusion about what had happened and why she had disappeared. Because my older sister, who was nearly 3, this was also her first memory. We weren't told that she had died. We weren't told where she went. We didn't know. And so this is how death was treated in our family. And it still is today for many families. The children are not included in conversations and in talking about grief and death. And in so many other experiences, I had a brother that got leukemia at the age of 14, and he died at the age of 16. And I had the opportunity to experience what it is like to be in a healthcare setting with professionals who were, many of them, very uncomfortable with the emotions of family members and with dying itself. And I saw the harm that came from that. And I had a friend in high school who died suddenly in a car crash, and my mother died and had a near-death experience, and that whole, so many of these experiences, and I'm not alone. Each one of you is here tonight because you have had some experience, or you will have some experience, and it's something that touches all of us. And what I learned so dramatically was how we respond to grief, how others respond to grief, and how that impacts the grieving process. So this idea of how society views death and grief has a dramatic impact on us and how our own experience. I believe our experience could be very different if we were in a context that embraced these experiences and wasn't afraid of them. I had a friend who was an emergency room social worker in Connecticut, and his wife had a baby, and the baby died within 24 hours of birth from some freak, bug. And he said that it was so incredibly difficult because at work, in an ER, where they are constantly dealing with death, his coworkers are so uncomfortable that he felt like he had to comfort them and help them. And he said, this is just really wrong, and over and over and over again, we all could share stories about how we were met with discomfort from others. And this has caused me in my journey to go on to really study grief and to want to learn about it, and also to want to help professionals learn how they can more appropriately respond and intervene with people who are grieving. And this resulted in the writing of a textbook called Living Through Loss, Interventions Across the Lifespan. I taught a university course on this topic, and it was, the course would fill up in like the first 10 minutes of enrollment. And people were always begging, please let me in, because people are just really knowing that this is going to be something that they're going to be confronted with in their professional life. And as a Buddhist practitioner now for many years, I've come to realize how very much I have been influenced through my Buddhist practice, through my practice, and through the study of the Dharma, how it has helped me to be so comfortable with grief and with death. And so tonight, what I'd like to do, we're going to take just a little bit of time to talk about the societal context and how death is viewed in society. And then we'll define what we mean by grief. And we'll talk about how the societal context then influences our experience with grief. And then we'll talk about what we can learn from the Buddha's teachings that might help us. So, how is death viewed in society? Now, I recognize that we all grew up in different societies. We have people from Germany and Mexico and Canada and the United States, and even within our own family, we've all had very different experiences. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask the question, how is death viewed in society? And I'd like you to say in 5 words or less, okay? So we're just getting at the bullet points, because we have a lot of very interesting things to explore tonight. So, let me ask the question, how is death viewed in society? Go ahead. You might have to come closer.
Hidden.
Oh, hidden, okay. Death is hidden, right. Death is hidden. So very interesting. Many years ago, I traveled to India on pilgrimage with Rinpoche, and we were at the burning ghats. And this is where people carry corpses down through the streets of the town to the cremation pyre. And the bodies are burned, and the ashes float all over and just land on you. And Rinpoche gave a teaching at that place that I will never forget. And someone that I talked to later said, I was just horrified that there was a hospice right next to the burning ghats. Can you believe they had this hospice right next door? That's just like putting death in people's face. And I'm like, well, death is in their face, right? But in the West, we want to hide it. We put people in rooms, we close them away. So hidden, for sure. How is death viewed in society? Because we're going to talk about how this affects our grief, okay? Tiki.
People want to avoid it. Avoidance, completely.
Yes. So not only is it hidden, but it's not something we want to be with. We want to be away from it. And you can think about how that affects, of course, the person who's dying, right? But it also has an effect on how we grieve. And we'll talk about that. So thank you, Diki. How is death viewed in society? Randy.
It's always feared. Most of the time it's something that we fear.
Yes, thank you. We're taught in many ways, now I can't say that this is true in all societies, but in our society we are taught to fear death. And as young children, children are shown very frightening images in popular culture about death. In movies, in comics, in Halloween, how we treat Halloween. I mean, I have seen so many children terrified. I remember some kids went up to the house next door to us to trick-or-treat, and they had a skeleton outside, and the skeleton like moved and made sounds when they came up. And the kids just shrieked and ran away without any candy and ran to our house crying. They were so afraid, And we put out little colorful lights that would sparkle and move around. But if you think about how children are exposed to death, and of course adults, that it's something frightening. Mm-hmm. What else? Tokme and then Diane.
Death is viewed as a failure.
Excellent. Absolutely. So we know, especially in Western hospitals, we know that I've known doctors who transfer patients off their wards so that their death rate isn't so high because it just doesn't it doesn't look good, right? That you don't want your patients to die, that it's viewed as a failure. And so what we often will do, and of course this isn't all doctors, right? But what we often will do is we try to keep people alive at any cost. And we think something is wrong if someone dies, that it's a failure, right? So that's really important. And then Diane.
Death is painful.
Death is painful. So again, and it's often tied into that fear that death will be very painful. And it can be, it doesn't have to be, but this idea that it's a scary, painful, difficult event. Yeah. Anything else? I have one more on my list. Okay, so I had all those, and death can be prevented if we take care of our health. We think we can avoid it. We think we have control over our death. Now, that's not to say that our actions don't affect our health, but it's absolutely not true that we can control our death. So, I'd like to have us consider how this conditioning influences how we grieve. But before we do that, let's talk about what is grief. So who would like to briefly define grief? What does it mean? Dorje.
The emotions that arise from loss.
The emotions that arise from loss. Okay. Yeah. So there are emotions, and I would add to that, because it can be more than emotions. It can be physical reactions. It can be a physiological effect. So it's any reaction to perceived loss, right? Because we can experience losses, but we don't perceive it as a loss. So like, let's say you lose your job, you get fired from your job, but you hated your job, you're really happy. So you really don't grieve that, right? So grief is our reaction to perceived loss or to any change we do not want or do not expect. Our reaction to perceived loss or to any change we do not want or expect. So we know that grief, we've been talking about death, but it's not the only thing that can precipitate a grieving, right? And what we're talking about tonight will be relevant to all kinds of grief. So what else do we grieve? Maybe even think about experiences you've had. What has caused grief in your life or in the life of those you love? Tenzing.
Rejection in a relationship.
Huge. Rejection in a relationship. The ending of a relationship. Relationships that have problems and we can't fix them. Very, very painful. You know, Rinpoche has said, one of the main reasons we're here is to learn how to get along with others. And so when our relationships aren't harmonious, or they change from being harmonious to being very difficult, or they end, it can be extremely distressing and cause grief, especially if we can't heal it. You know, if we feel like we can't bring healing to the relationship. Other thoughts? Diane?
We can grieve the loss of an organ inside of us after a surgery. Something has been removed from us.
Yeah.
We can grieve that.
Yes, yes. And of course, all the physical health problems we can have and the changes in our health, any number of changes in our health, where we're not able to function as we were before. Have any of you ever lost a wallet? Right? We can, grieve from divorce, pet loss, we lose our animals, your computer crashes. I'm telling you, I've seen a lot of tears over, computer crashes. So anything, though, that we don't expect and don't want. And it's not what we wanted, not what we expected. It's not what we think should be. but it is what we have. And it's also a universal part of the human experience. There's no one who is born into this world who doesn't experience grief. So, how does the societal context influence our grief? We'll come back to all those things we talked about before, about how we view death, or just how we, how do people respond to our grief? How does that influence our grief? What are your thoughts? Peme Kipu.
Often people are very uncomfortable when there's any strong feeling involved.
Yes, thank you. That's a good point. That, of course, if someone has experienced a death and people are afraid of death and they're uncomfortable, they may be very uncomfortable with what's happening even in that moment. But people can also be uncomfortable with strong emotion. And a lot of people are. So what happens is they pull away. People pull away from one another. And then the person grieving is left without feeling like there's something wrong, like they did something wrong. Because no one wants to, I've talked to, I used to do a lot of research with older men who were caring for wives with dementia, and they would describe this experience of in the grocery store, walking down the aisle, and seeing a friend come around the corner, and the friend sees them and ducks into the next aisle. Because they were uncomfortable, like, oh my gosh, here comes my friend who now is caring for his wife with dementia, and, or whose wife just died, and I don't know what to say, so we avoid, and it's very painful, and that can exacerbate our grief. Other thoughts? Kandra, you had your hand up.
Well, the thought of the hidden aspect, if you have strong feelings and you think that other people, like if you lost a relationship and you don't want to show that you're feeling bad, so you kind of bottle it up,
Yeah, suppressing feelings. There's low battery, by the way. Suppressing feelings, denying feelings, pushing them away, bottling them up, and people can get very sick through this process. And many years ago, I heard this saying from a grief therapist that young men cry with bullets, because so many young men have had extensive trauma growing up in a culture where they're expected to be, machismo, and they are really hurting inside. They're very tender, and they've had a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, and so they end up crying with bullets. So another example of that, so thank you. Other thoughts? Tawanarbu.
I think offering a short-term solution or a diversion, like your cat died, have a cookie, you'll feel better.
Yes.
Or lost a relationship. Well, there are plenty of fish in the sea.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, all the platitudes that people say. There was a researcher who interviewed lots of people who had experienced death, and they asked them what were the things people said to them, their friends, the sayings that people said to them. And there were some like 230 different things that you could be pretty sure were common responses to people who were grieving. And about 220 of them were unhelpful. Okay. She's in a better place. Hey, I don't want to hear that if I'm grieving. What are you talking about? She should be here with me, right? Or, well, at least she's not suffering anymore. Or on and on. I mean, each one of you probably have heard these sayings, right? And it creates distance between us because, well, first of all, these things aren't true, and they're just iterations of people's discomfort, because they want to feel better. They don't want you to hurt, so they think if they just say this, then you'll stop hurting. But again, the message is you shouldn't be feeling what you're feeling, right? Coming back to Pema Kipu's point that people are uncomfortable with emotion. Pamela.
To your question, Lama, to me, I was thinking that one tendency is just to deny any loss or to fail to recognize other losses in your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So to deny losses, and so we just, we have these repeated experiences that, okay, well, I'm not supposed to feel anything, so I'm just gonna pull it together and just move forward, right? So what happens with that is that it's called unattended sorrow. Okay, Stephen Levine wrote a book called Unattended Sorrow, and he talked about the myriad problems with unattended sorrow. Gradual diminishment of our life force, because we're not being authentic, we're not expressing our experience. Less trust in ourselves and others. Compulsive busyness. Addictions of all kinds. Avoiding or hiding in relationships. Delayed grief or prolonged grief. And what can happen is we have these experiences and we don't allow ourselves in this scenario to grieve or to be with what's happening. And then what happens is it's still there. It's the same as like holding a grudge. It's still there. Until you've healed it, it's still there. And so the next time you have a loss, guess what? That wound is right there. But if you do what Pema is saying, you keep again and again and again. And then, you end up getting cancer or whatever it is, that it's not inconsequential to ignore the pain that we might be experiencing or to pretend it's not there if it is. So, lots for us to think about here, but I'm going to move us forward now. I think we get the idea, the challenge. One morning at Breakfast Club, Rinpoche was talking about what it means. We say, I take refuge in the three precious gems. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Okay. And she was talking about what it means to take refuge in the Dharma. And the Dharma are the teachings of the Buddha. And what it means is that the Dharma is crafted for us to put into practice and to take action to move us away from the suffering state. So the Dharma is the medicine for our suffering, and so many of the Buddha's teachings are related to loss and grief. So I'm just going to pick just a couple little things for us to talk about tonight, but just to say, this was a very prevailing topic in the teachings of the Buddha. The very first teaching of the Buddha began, his expression of this deep understanding of the human condition. That although, we can look around, we can feel like there's great beauty in the world, there's great beauty in our lives, the first noble truth is that actually the truth of suffering. And one of the Buddha's own definitions of suffering is being separated from the people we want to be with. And not wanting to be with the people we would rather not be with, right? So he talked about this as attachment and clinging, that we love and we want to be with and we just enjoy, and it's so wonderful. And aversion, we want to push away. And we could be talking about aversion of our grief too, right? So this is a form of suffering when we push it away. And he said that there are three primary poisons that bind us to suffering, the suffering state, to samsara. And that's attachment, aversion, and ignorance. So when we don't see things the way they really are, when we cling to things, and when we push things away. So the teachings of the Buddha can help us to better prepare for times of change and loss. And they also can help us while we're grieving. So tonight we're going to look at how the teachings and contemplations on impermanence and the inevitability of loss might help prepare us for times of loss. And then we'll talk about some practices and contemplations when we're actually grieving. So the Buddha taught repeatedly on the truth of impermanence. The Buddha said, "What is born will die. What has been gathered will be dispersed. What has been accumulated will be exhausted. And what has been built up will collapse." So these are all reflecting the changes that are pressing upon us. He also said that all conditioned things, so in all conditioned things he's talking about all things that depend on conditions, anything that depends on anything else to exist, which is every atom of phenomena in this world. All conditioned things have the nature of vanishing. His last teaching was on the truth of impermanence. As he was approaching his death, he knew he was going to die soon. And he told one of his dear disciples, Ananda, I'm going to die. And Ananda became very distressed. "Oh, Lord Buddha, no. He just became very distressed. "Please, don't leave us. We need you. Please." And the Buddha said, "Ananda, what have I been telling you after all? After all these years?" And Ananda was able, as a practitioner of many, many years studying with the Buddha, he was able to go, "Oh yes, I see." For others, the Buddha taught about impermanence so compassionately, and I think the most, because of course we wouldn't go to a friend if they just experienced a death and say, well, or if they're dying, well, it's all impermanent, right? We would never do that. But the Buddha knew he could say that to Ananda, right? But another story is of how the Buddha compassionately taught impermanence is the story of Kisa Gotami. And this was a young mother whose husband had died, and her very young child had died, her only child. And she was mad. She was inconsolable. And she basically carried this little corpse around with her through the villages, begging people, "Please, do you have any medicine? Please, help me. And everyone was so concerned because this was such unusual behavior. And one compassionate man said, "Oh, please, you know what? I think I know someone who can help you. The Buddha is actually in this next village. You should go see him." And she just quickly ran to this village and went to the Buddha, and he looked at her. And he saw what was happening for her. And she said, "Oh, please, Lord Buddha, I've heard you might be able to help me. My baby has died. Please, can you bring him back to life?" And he said, oh my dear, yes, I will help you. But in order to help you, I need you to get something for me." And she said, "Oh, I will get you anything. What is it? And he said, "Well, you need to gather a handful of mustard seeds from the village." And she said, "Oh, immediately she thought, oh, wonderful, I know that mustard seeds grew so readily in this area. She was like, oh, this is great. Started to run off, and he said, wait. They must be mustard seeds from homes who have not been touched by death. And so she was like, okay, she was encouraged. She was like, okay, I'm going to do this. This is my chance to bring this baby back. And so there she went. And from house to house she went, and she looked into the eyes of these mothers and these fathers and brothers and grandsons, granddaughters. And every one of them shared their grief at the loss. They all had mustard seeds. And her experience of witnessing this completely opened her heart to understanding this truth. And it really freed her. And she was able then to go, dispose of the body. And she went to the Buddha and said, please let me study with you. Thank you for helping me. And so contemplating impermanence can be very helpful to us. And I will say, even just in my experience in my life with so many deaths, I was, even just that, I'm so much more prepared for death when it comes. But I've also spent a lot of time contemplating it. And there's lots of wonderful contemplations. I'm going to share with you one contemplation that you can try and work with when you have time and you're ready to take this on. This comes from Chagud Tulku Rinpoche from his book Change of Heart. And he said, a mere theoretical understanding of impermanence won't have much impact on your life. Unless we truly assimilate its meaning through meditation, we will continue to grasp at things that will certainly fail us. So what he's saying is, you can't just intellectually know that everything's impermanent. You have to know. You have to make it so deep in your being that you really know. And you do that through contemplation. And so he said you can begin by examining every aspect of your experience. So you might sit down one day and you might think about the universe, the earth, your neighborhood, your relationships, your body, your speech, your interests and values, even your identity, and see if you can find anything in any of those categories that is permanent and that does not change. And he suggests that you contemplate. You could take one or two of these, contemplate it, and then let the mind rest. Take some quiet time, just sit in the silence with that, and then begin again and contemplate another category or the same category. And this is one method of, deepening our understanding that everything is changing and nothing can stay the same. There's also, we won't have time to go through this now, but I just love the 9 contemplations of Atisha. You can Google this. But these contemplations were developed and can actually be an enlightenment practice. You would sit with them. So I'll read the first one. The first contemplation. Death is inevitable. No one is exempt. Holding this thought in mind, I abide in the breath. So this is just like this other exercise. You would just contemplate that and sit with it and allow it to percolate in your mind. So there's 9 of them. You can Google it, 9 contemplations of Atisha. And that's another practice for bringing this more deeply into our awareness. The other teaching, the inevitability of loss. The Buddhists spoke about the inevitability of loss in many ways, but he also prescribed a practice to work with the fact of loss. And the practice is called the 5 recollections, and is described in the Upattana Sutra. And here are the 5 recollections. I am of the nature to age. Age is unavoidable. I am of the nature to get ill. Illness is unavoidable. I am of the nature to die. Death is unavoidable. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot avoid the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground on which I stand. And the Buddha encouraged everyone, lay and ordained, women and men, to contemplate these 5 realities on a daily basis. Now, the idea in all of these contemplations, it's not to make you miserable. If you find that you're on too shaky ground to do these contemplations right now, wait until you feel more stable. But these awarenesses are actually what compelled Prince Siddhartha to leave the palace and try to find something that was more enduring, to try to find the answers to his questions about why do people suffer? Why do these things happen? And seeing these realities when he snuck out of the palace and saw aging and death and illness, he was so shocked because he had been hidden from that, right? So if we hide ourselves from all these things, we will be more shocked when they come to us. So these are the facts of life, even if we do our best to avoid them. And each one of them is either true for us right now, or it will be true for us in the future. And you can, put these on your refrigerator. You can recite them out loud daily. You can begin each meditation session by recollecting each one. You can contemplate them before going to bed or getting up in the morning, however you want. But let's just briefly talk about, so how does deeply understanding impermanence and these facts benefit us or help prepare us for loss? Pemikipu.
So if we were to understand these things more deeply, we might not be as attached.
Yes. So, and in particular, we might not be as clinging to things because we would know that they aren't ours to keep, right? And along with that, these help us to cherish what we have, to cherish what we do have. Because of my experiences, I always taught my children, we never leave the house angry. We never go to sleep if there's something that is unresolved. And, even when my son was in high school, he would kiss me, he'd kiss me goodbye in front of all of his friends and say, I love you, Mom, you're the best mom in the world. Because he was taught that this might be the last time he saw me. It just was really ingrained in him. And so we can embrace what we have and appreciate it more. We don't take it for granted. Thank you. Sonam Kipu, what would you like to share? That's what you were going to share? Okay. Other thoughts? Yes, Lakmatachi.
Yeah, prepare as loss.
We are better prepared when loss happens. We're not so shocked. And I know, for me, I had an experience where my father was killed in a crash. And I had seen him a few weeks before. And when we were together, I took a picture of him holding our 6-month-old daughter, and the camera died. And I thought, pay attention. Something in me alerted to pay attention. So I actually wasn't at all surprised when that phone rang. And I know death can come at any time, right? So when we deliberately face these realities, we are less at the mercy of the experiences when they happen. And we're more aligned with the laws of nature instead of struggling against them. And then grief becomes a process of helping us to adjust to the loss, rather than spending a lot of our time consumed by, oh, this shouldn't have happened, right? We got a lot of work to do just to manage our grief. Okay. So the other thing I will say is that understanding these truths does not mean that we will not experience grief. I was reading in The Magnanimous Heart by Narayan Liebenson, who's a Buddhist practitioner, and she said that after 30 years of Buddhist practice, she had not known any of the most venerable senior practitioners who had not experienced sorrow. She said, what is different for a skilled practitioner is not the arising of sorrow, but the perspective on it. Feeling is not itself a problem. Grief is not a problem. Grasping is the problem and the source of suffering. Grasping at the thought that whatever is causing the grief should not be happening. A skilled practitioner allows the sorrow to be as it is, while grounding in the here and now, without grasping, resisting, or nourishing the grief. A person untrained in meditation may instinctually reject or justify their sorrow, which compounds the pain. And there was a story about this a very senior Zen master who experienced the death of a dear friend, and he was crying. And his students were like, well, Master, why are you crying? They just didn't expect him to cry. And he said, well, of course I'm crying. My dear friend just died. And then, just like that, he got up and he made himself a cup of tea. He allowed himself to experience what was arising. He didn't push it away, right? So we're not trying to become a stone Buddha that doesn't breathe, doesn't feel pain, and doesn't experience joy. We recall these facts of nature in order to live our lives with a greater sense of lightness and to recognize that this moment and every moment matters. Okay, so let's shift gears now and talk about what the Buddha taught to help us while grieving. I want to preface this by saying that there are two common ways I've seen people grieve. And the first, as we've talked about, is to avoid pain and emotions. And a lot of people distract themselves. They start consuming lots of food or sweets, or they drink alcohol. I've seen people become very sexually active when they're grieving. All sorts of distractions, drugs, busyness, consumed by busyness. And this causes more suffering, as we said before, right? The second way that many people grieve is to become consumed by grief, to become identified with the suffering while feeling aversion to the painful feelings one is consumed by. I know this sounds weird, but people do it. It's common. In a book I was reading, Bearing the Unbearable, a Zen Buddhist therapist describes this heart-wrenching encounter with a young woman who came to her for help, who was screaming in her office after the death of her son, "I hate grief. I don't want it anymore. I want you to make it stop. It's killing me." And it literally was. So this is an example of it. She was so consumed by it and hating it that she was just toxic. There was just so much toxicity in her energetic being, and it was really harming her. And so both of these strategies are in direct opposition to the wisdom that was shared by the Buddha. So he talked about, actually I want to share, in his first sermon he said this. He said, "Brothers, why do I call this path the right way? I call it the right path because it does not avoid or deny suffering, but allows for a direct confrontation with suffering as the means to overcome it." And the Zen Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh said, "Please don't run away from your suffering. Embrace it and cherish it with understanding and compassion. You will be able to heal the wounds in your heart and the wounds in the world. Suffering is called a holy truth because our suffering has the capacity of showing us the path to liberation. Embrace your suffering and let it reveal to you the way to peace." So Thich Nhat Hanh is suggesting that we need to give ourselves the time and space to experience strong emotions with mindfulness, with compassion, with gentleness and acceptance in order to move through our suffering. Now, what's the difference between embracing our suffering and being consumed by our suffering? Because we might easily get these confused. Lakvisopa.
It's without clinging.
It's without clinging. Embracing our suffering is without clinging. Thank you. Tenzing?
I think that there's, when we embrace our feelings, our suffering, we have a capacity to have some objectivity.
Can you come a little closer? That's good. Tenzing's coming a little closer so you can hear her also.
So when we embrace our suffering with compassion or mindfulness, we have some objectivity. There's a little bit of a separation that we can be objective, or rather than being consumed and you're just totally, you can't even.
Yeah, so there's a part of us, there's an energy that's arising up in us that's different from the energy of grief. And this new energy of mindfulness is what can, so there's a space between these, right? There's a space between these. If we're observing something, we are not that thing, right? And when our suffering is the strongest, it's when we are the suffering, right? We say, "I am angry. I'm angry. This shouldn't have happened. I'm angry." We are identified with our anger. But when we say, "I see that I am feeling anger," it's a very different experience. There is a movement away. Okay, so that's a really good point. Lakmatashi, can you come forward, please?
One thing only.
Okay.
We are not suffering about our suffering.
We are not suffering about our suffering when we embrace it?
Yeah. What you have described now, explain.
I'm sorry, what was that?
What you described right now is explain this.
Oh yeah, what I just described explains that. Yeah, we're not suffering from our suffering. Thank you. Yeah, so any other thoughts about how they're different? embracing our suffering versus being consumed by our suffering. Georgie.
Just the phrases themselves, embracing has a compassionate, loving sense, and then consuming is almost like a burning.
Yeah.
So just the very terms evoke those images and those feelings.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I really like this phrase, embracing, because it does come with a feeling tone of care and tenderness, so that if we're prone, and we've learned to be harsh with ourselves, or, sometimes we might feel like there's something wrong with us because people, are saying, can you get over this? I have to say that this book I wrote, I co-authored with one of my dear friends in Seattle who had her son fell off of Mount McKinley and to his death, helping someone else in a mountain climbing expedition. And he was missing for several days. And she was so consumed by her grief. And, she wanted to write, but she said, the only thing I can write about is grief. But she was really consumed by her grief. But what happened for her was so difficult is that she said that so many of her friends just tired of it, over time. They're like, well, they can be really supportive for a little while, but after a while, come on, you're supposed to feel better now. But, she's never going to feel better, she's never going to get over it, right? So that's an important, but when we, and of course, because she was consumed with her grief, that did affect how she moved through it. But this idea of embracing is really bringing a gentleness and a tenderness to it. So how do we embrace suffering? You've really touched upon it already. I think Tenzing brought up the idea of mindfulness. The Buddha recommended mindfulness. He said, this is the way, practitioners, for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the dissolving of suffering and grief, for walking a wise path, for the realization of awakening, namely the 4 ways of being present. And when he's talking about the 4 ways of being present, he's referring to the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So this includes mindfulness of body, what's happening in the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of states of mind, and mindfulness of phenomena. And mindfulness, so, we might think about, so how can we bring mindfulness to grief? So if we have these 4 foundations of mindfulness, what does that have to do with our grief, right? What do you think? Rinchen Tashi?
It seems as if those are a way, like we experience grief in our body, for example. And so those are ways we can be aware of, just the way things like grief is affecting us on these different levels.
Right, exactly. So we can take time to sit and observe in our grief what's happening in the body. Where am I feeling this grief? And breathing into it. And there's this idea of mere recognition of what we're experiencing. And this is the practice of just noticing. Of, what am I experiencing in my mind? What am I experiencing in my body? Where do I feel this? What emotions are present? What is my state of mind? The sensations in the body associated with the thoughts. And we can bring awareness to our breath and breathe into our grief and just breathe into the grief and breathe out. And we begin to see through doing this practice we begin to see that these thoughts and feelings, like everything else, will come for a while and stay for a while and go away. And they will come back, and we can observe that. We observe that. So we become less, solidified in it. Pema.
I was thinking of answering that mindfulness helps us cultivate the skill of being with what is, and I think it sounds like that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, so Pema was saying it helps us cultivate the skill of being with what is. Yeah, exactly. So there's that. And when you mindfully notice what's happening, when you tell yourself, I'm having the thought that this shouldn't be happening to me, you know this is just a thought. It could be true or untrue or somewhere in between, but you don't have to accept all of the thoughts blindly. When we get lost in the thoughts or our feelings and are so identified with them, they're factual, they're true. There was a woman whose daughter was in a coma in the ICU. She was on the hospital floor crying, and an older man came by. She described him as a peasant. I don't know where she was and what she was doing, but he said, get up, get off the floor. And she was crying, well, why is this happening to me? Why me? And he said, why not? Why not you? And she began to question, this hospital was filled with other people. And it really, kind of just like, oh, so we don't have to accept everything, don't believe everything you think, sort of thing. And then the other element, this mere recognition, the other element is this deep embracing of what we experience. And for this we can evoke, like Dorje was saying before, there is this feeling that comes when we think about embracing. And we might think of a young mother with her baby, and the baby's crying, and the mother's embracing the baby, and she's tending it, and she's trying to discern the distress and where the distress is, right? She's not avoiding it, and she's not trying to suppress it. She's not saying, will you grow up already? Stop crying, She's embracing. And so this is what we can do with our own grief. We can even use imagery, like we might think of a mountain, stable, steady, and strong, and be that presence with our grief. Or we might think of a clear, calm crystal lake and be that presence. Or we might think of the Buddha or of Jesus or Mother Mary and bring those qualities to our grief. And this can evoke a calmness in us and a tenderness that will help process what's happening. So mindfulness and impermanence and inevitability of loss, all of this remind us that pain and sorrow, like everything else, are temporary experiences. And this doesn't mean that grief disappears, but we begin to see that it can't stay the same, it changes shape. And it also helps us through these experiences. It helps us become more capable of being of benefit to others. Because I promise you, everyone you know is going to grieve at some point in your knowing them. And the extent to which you're able to skillfully address your own and care for your own grief will be the extent to which you're able to really be with those you love and to be a healing presence in their life. So we've come to the end of our time. I really appreciated your sharing and exploring this really important topic with me. In the spring, I'm going to begin another series of 4 classes that start in March. I'll be on retreat January and February. Topics are to be determined, but we will let you know about that. And I would like to just say that any benefit from this teaching tonight comes from the amazing guidance I've received from my precious teacher, and any errors are completely my own. And if you would now join me in dedication. May my capacity for compassion be infinite. I dedicate these efforts to complete and total enlightenment, so that I may be of benefit to all sentient beings. May it be so. Good night.
Thank you, Lama.
Thank you, Lama.
Gracias, Lama.
Ah.